Is it possible for a pre-industrial state, devoid of computers, satellites, and modern financial instruments, to manage a supply chain more complex and vital than those serving many modern cities? The question seems paradoxical, yet the Roman state accomplished precisely this for centuries. The story of their solution, the cura annoni, is not one of simple charity, but a masterclass in pragmatic state intervention born from catastrophic market failure. It reveals a timeless economic truth. When a market essential for social stability proves incapable of providing it, the state is inevitably forced to become the system architect. Now, let's open the historical ledger and analyze the economic blueprint this crisis left behind. The city of Rome in the late Republic was an economic anomaly. It had swelled into a megacity, likely the first in human history to house 1 million inhabitants, yet produced almost nothing to feed itself. This metropolis was a sprawling consumer, a vortex of demand situated in the heart of an empire, entirely dependent on a constant inflow of grain from its provinces. In the early and middle Republic, the private market, a network of merchants, shippers, and speculators, largely met this need. Grain flowed from Sicily, Sardinia, and Campania, driven by the simple logic of profit. But as the city's population exploded, this system began to exhibit profound systemic weaknesses. When we analyze its structure, we see a textbook case of market failure on a monumental scale. The first critical failure was logistical fragility. The entire system was predicated on maritime transport, an enterprise fraught with peril. Storms could delay or destroy entire fleets, and the winter months closed the seas to reliable navigation, creating a predictable annual bottleneck. More disruptive was piracy. The unchecked power of the Cilician pirates in the 1st century BC demonstrated that non-state actors could effectively hold the capital's food supply hostage, creating artificial scarcity and sending prices soaring. These were negative externalities the private market had no incentive or capability to solve. A merchant's calculus does not include funding a navy. The second failure was information asymmetry. In an age without instant communication, rumors of a bad harvest in Sicily or a storm in the Tyrrhenian Sea were as potent as the events themselves. Merchants with better information, or those willing to gamble, could hoard supplies, waiting for the inevitable price spike. This speculative behavior, while rational for the individual actor, was destabilizing for the system as a whole. It amplified the volatility of both supply and price, turning minor disruptions into major crises for the urban plebs who lived on a razor's edge, their survival tied directly to the daily cost of bread. Finally, the sheer scale of Rome's demand distorted the market beyond recognition. There was no substitute good for grain. It was the foundational calorie source. This inelastic demand meant that even small shortages could lead to astronomical price increases. Historical records from figures like Cicero detail the political fallout. Food riots were not uncommon. They were a recurring feature of late Republican life. Ambitious politicians quickly learned that control over the grain supply was a direct route to popular support and political power. The cry for bread and circuses was not the whine of a lazy populace. It was a rational demand for economic stability from a population facing the existential threat of a market that had repeatedly failed them. The senatorial elite recognized this not as a moral problem, but as a critical threat to their own power and the stability of the republic. Private enterprise had built the supply lines, but it had proven utterly incapable of guaranteeing the one thing the capital needed above all else: security. The stage was set for a radical intervention. The chaotic and unreliable market of the late Republic could not be merely regulated. It had to be fundamentally re-engineered. The solution, formalized under the Emperor Augustus, was the cura annoni, the care for the grain supply. This was not a simple welfare program. When we deconstruct its architecture, we find an astonishingly sophisticated state-directed supply chain, a hybrid model that leveraged private enterprise while socializing systemic risk. It was an admission that the security of the capital's food supply was a public good, too vital to be left to the unpredictable whims of private speculation and maritime fortune. The state stepped in not as a competitor to the market, but as its ultimate guarantor and manager. The first pillar of this new system was procurement. The haphazard purchasing of the Republican era was replaced by a predictable and massive inflow of grain, primarily sourced as a tax in kind from key provinces. Egypt, following its annexation, became the personal breadbasket of the emperor. Its immense agricultural surplus was no longer a commodity to be bought on the open market. It was a state asset, a tax revenue stream paid in grain, not coin. North Africa, particularly the province of Africa Proconsularis, modern-day Tunisia, functioned as the second critical source. As this map of trade routes clearly shows, these two regions alone could supply the vast majority of Rome's annual needs. This policy shift had a profound economic effect. It insulated the core of Rome's supply from market price fluctuations and harvest variations in other regions. The state was no longer just a buyer. It was the largest single owner of grain in the Mediterranean. The second pillar was transportation, and it is here we see the genius of the hybrid model. The Roman state did not build a colossal merchant marine. Instead, it created a powerful set of economic incentives to compel private ship owners, the navicularii, to serve the public need. The state effectively became the system's insurer. Merchants who signed contracts to carry state grain were granted significant privileges. They received exemptions from certain taxes, legal protections for their assets, and, most critically, a state guarantee against the risk of shipwreck. If a storm claimed a ship laden with Annona grain, the owner was compensated from the imperial treasury. This single policy transformed the risk calculus for private shippers. It socialized the greatest existential threat to their business, the loss of a ship and cargo, thereby ensuring a steady and willing fleet of transport vessels. The state dictated the destination and the cargo, but the private sector, motivated by profit and protected by policy, handled the execution. Upon arrival in Italy, the grain entered the third pillar, a state-owned infrastructure of distribution. The port of Ostia, and later Portus, was transformed into a monumental logistics hub. We have archaeological evidence of massive warehouse complexes, the Hauria, capable of storing many months' worth of supply for the city. This strategic reserve acted as a buffer, smoothing out the peaks and troughs of the seasonal shipping cycle and providing a cushion against unexpected disruptions. A dedicated civil service, overseen by a powerful equestrian official, the Praefectus Annoni, managed this entire logistical tale. They tracked shipments, monitored warehouse levels, and oversaw the final distribution within the city of Rome itself. This bureaucracy was the system's central nervous system, translating imperial policy into the daily reality of a reliable food supply. Finally, we must analyze the fiscal policy at the consumer's end. The Annona evolved from selling grain at a subsidized, fixed price to a full-blown free distribution. The famous grain dole for a fixed roster of eligible male citizens, which numbered around 200,000 for much of the early empire. From a purely economic perspective, this represents a price ceiling set at zero. It did not eliminate the private grain market in Rome, a common misconception, but it fundamentally altered it. The Annona provided a baseline of caloric security. Those wanting higher quality flour, or those ineligible for the dole, still purchased from private bakers and merchants. But the state's intervention removed the existential threat of starvation from the political equation. This massive expenditure was not expected to generate revenue. Its dividend was political stability. By guaranteeing this basic subsistence, the emperor short-circuited the cycle of food riots and political instability that had plagued the late Republic. The Annona was, in effect, the premium paid on an insurance policy against revolution. In deconstructing this system, we see a government acting with profound economic pragmatism, creating a vertically integrated supply chain that fused state authority with private efficiency to solve a problem the free market alone could not. It was a triumph of logistics, an engine of stability that powered the Roman peace for centuries. Yet, for all its brilliance, the Annona was a monument to a specific set of geopolitical and economic conditions, and its structural rigidity would ultimately become its fatal flaw. The system's success bred a dangerous dependency. For centuries, the city of Rome was a managed economic ecosystem, its population insulated from the true cost of their sustenance. When we analyze the long-term fiscal implications, we see that the Annona was viable only as long as the state could effortlessly extract the agricultural surplus of its key provinces. The entire edifice rested on the military and administrative control of Egypt and North Africa, and the security of the sea lanes connecting them to Italy. The crisis of the 3rd century shattered this foundation. Civil wars, breakaway empires, and external invasions crippled the state's ability to collect taxes and protect shipping. With its revenue streams severed and its control fragmented, the imperial government struggled to finance the immense logistical machine. Debasement of the currency, a common tool to meet state obligations, was useless for a system that ran on commodities, not coin. You cannot print grain. The Annona began to falter not because its design was unintelligent, but because the broader economic and political system that guaranteed its inputs had disintegrated. Historical records for this period are sparse, but the archaeological evidence points to a sharp decline in Rome's population, suggesting the unraveling of the supply chain that had made its unnatural size possible. The system was too successful, too centralized, and too vital to fail gracefully. Its decline was a key symptom of the wider collapse of the Western Empire. When we turn our lens to the 21st century, the echo of the Annona is unmistakable. Our own megacities, Tokyo, Lagos, Sao Paulo, are modern Romes, vast concentrations of population utterly dependent on complex global supply chains. We have replaced the Roman state's direct intervention with the hyper-efficiency of the just-in-time global market. But the underlying vulnerabilities remain. Where Rome feared pirates and winter storms, we fear geopolitical choke points in the Strait of Hormuz or the South China Sea, global pandemics that cripple port logistics, or energy shocks that make transport costs spiral. The Roman state socialized risk by underwriting private shipping. Our modern states do something similar, albeit less directly, by funding the navies that patrol sea lanes and building the vast port and highway infrastructure that private logistics companies rely on. The core principle holds. The stability of the food supply is a public good underwritten by state power. The critical lesson from the Annona's collapse is a warning against confusing efficiency with resilience. Our just-in-time model is extraordinarily efficient, minimizing storage costs and maximizing capital turnover. But its lack of redundancy, its equivalent of Rome's great Horia, makes it brittle. A disruption in one part of the chain can cascade through the system with terrifying speed, as recent global events have shown. The Annona, for all its costs and inefficiencies, was built for resilience through massive stockpiling. It reminds us that for a system as critical as urban food security, the most efficient solution may not be the most stable one. The fundamental challenge remains unchanged, ensuring that the engines of supply, whether managed by a prefectus or a market algorithm, can withstand the inevitable shocks of a complex world. The Roman experiment with the Annona was more than a historical curiosity. It was a profound, centuries-long lesson in the interplay between markets, state power, and the fundamental needs of a complex society. Its rise and fall demonstrate that while the technologies of logistics evolve, the foundational challenge of securing society's most basic provisions remains a constant test of political and economic foresight, reminding us that the intricate systems that sustain our modern lives are often more fragile than we dare to believe.